All right, hello and welcome back for another bearded D20 rambling about very indie game design. We are back here with more of the One Ring Second Edition Magic Hack. This is the combat section. Uh, in the previous video, went over all this stuff. So, if you're curious, you should go back and watch that one. But this is going to be strictly about combat and then how combat works in general. And then we're going to get into how you can run this for grid, zone, and theater of the mind. So first, I guess we will recap combat. So you take your, when you decide you want to make a check and enter structured mode, you will decide, or really the player describes what they're doing. And then the GM calls out that a check needs to be made, and then the player will build their dice pool based on their weapon proficiency and whatever physique proficiency they want to use. And this will give us our d12 plus xd6 dice pool, where the number of d6 you have is equal to the combination of these two ratings. So if you had a sword rating of 2 and you wanted to use athletics of 1, you would have 1d12 plus 3d6 in your dice pool. If our physique rating was 6, then our physique success value, which is 20 minus 6, so 14. Because of this rating, we have endurance of 30, since we take 6 times 5, 30. And then we also know that our weapon size can be 6. So we are wielding a size 6 sword. Just you could wield something smaller, but I think every player is going to strive to find something that meets what their rating. And so it's probably safe to say you could run a world where most weapons are size 5 by default, and then if a player is stronger, they have 6, 7, or 8 physique, then they can go commission a bigger weapon to be crafted for their physique rating. I don't know about you, but I enjoy how so much can be calculated off of knowing just a single value. We get 3 pieces of information basically from just the physique rating itself. Anyways, so in order to pass a sword check, we roll this pool, and we have to get 14 or greater, since this is a rollover system. And since all the rules are player facing, when you're attacking another NPC, the NPC's proficiency pool becomes disadvantaged to your roll. So I think it's a safe bet that in a game like Sword of 2 and Athletic of 1 is a pretty standard beginning character set of proficiencies. This gives you roughly a 50% chance to beat a 15. So you're a little bit better than that, and that's fine. You don't have to roll straight over the roll to get a success. You can spend your focus, your allies can spend gravitas, or you could burn in a point of advantage pool. Those are all resources that are talked out before, but if you're watching this and you haven't watched the previous video, know that while the math is not exactly in your favor, you have a lot of resources to make sure that you succeed. Because the game is about resource management. So a bad dice roll is more of a question of how much is this going to cost the group for me to succeed than if you will succeed. Let's see. So anyways, so disadvantage turns d6s into d4s, and advantage turns d6s into d8s. So if we were fighting an NPC that had a proficiency of 2, then this would turn this pool into a d12, 1d6, and 2d4. So knock our percent down again, and we're going to have to burn more resources to get up to the success value. And I know I mentioned it in part of other descriptions, but just because you got knocked, just because a d6 is knocked down to a d4, you can still spend focus, and your allies can still spend gravitas to boost that 4 up to 6 to do a trigger roll. And if you have a d8, then that just gives you a better chance of rolling the trigger roll without having to spend resources. So that's another nice thing about advantage. Now, what I didn't talk about in the last one is that because of the way the dice work, when you get attacked and you're making a reaction roll, well, we'll get there. Let's see, player cost action, you're looking for 12s and 6s on these dice. And then for NPC caused reaction rolls, the GM is looking for 1s on both dice. So because it's player facing and the NPCs don't make rolls, when they attack you, you have to succeed your check against them in order to defend yourself. And a success basically counts as them failing. And then if you roll a 1, that works the same way as if you had rolled a 12. So when you're making a reaction roll to defend yourself, so we'll reverse this, where the NPC attacks you. So in this case, once again, the pool imposes disadvantage on the defender. And for defense and offense, different weapons provide advantage and disadvantage depending on what the weapons are. I think it's a little out of the scope to go into the details of exactly which weapons do what and what the values of those are yet, because those can change, and they will change depending on what genre you're playing and custom weapons that are added. All you have to know is that it matters whether the player caused the action, because certain weapons are better at attacking, and it matters what you're wielding when you make a reaction, because certain things are better at defense, like spears and shields. So shields is where you get advantage on your defense roll. That's how shields work. And because of that, shields can cancel out a lot of the attacker's disadvantage, making this a lot easier to pass with lesser resources. Whereas attacking, there's fewer weapons that give bonuses to attacking. But anyways, so when you're attacking, you're looking for that 12 that is a critical hit, and that triggers the armor penetration check. I guess we'll get there. We're getting there now, ahead of ourselves. So actually, I guess we'll move damage, defense, and critical over. I guess we'll cover those now since we're already talking about them. So when you get a 12, you cause an armor piercing check to be made. When you are attacked and you roll a 1 on the d12, then you have to make an armor check against the opponent's piercing. And just as how the player gets staggered every time you're attacked, increasing the threat range, same thing happens to both you and NPCs. So if you attack an NPC, if all three players attack one NPC in a turn, the first player that attacks inflicts one stagger. Then the second PC that attacks the same NPC, if that NPC hasn't had a turn yet, it still has one stagger, increasing the crit chance by one. So now that second player that's attacking will crit on a 12 or 11, and then the third one will crit on a 10, 11, or 12. Now reverse that. If you have three NPCs attacking a player, the first one will trigger a penetration roll on a 1, the second one will 2, the third one on a 3. And then once the player has a turn, they can reduce the stagger by 1 by default, and then they can do something. So every time you're hit, stagger builds up regardless of how much damage you take and regardless of if you've been crit or not. It's a way to impose a clock on combat. So the longer it goes on, stagger will continue to build and build. And once people become weary from damage, then they stop losing the ability to mitigate stagger, and then it really becomes a countdown clock until bodies start dropping on one way or the other. All right, so damage. Damage is based on your weapon size. And we're only going to talk about physical combat here, but the same general rules apply for magic combat. It's just since the weapon size comes from your physique rating, your perception rating and persona rating are your base damage values for magic. If you're using magic that causes damage, which technically every spell stresses people out in some way. I guess the real question is whether or not the magic you're using is actually lethal or not. But again, we'll deal with magic another time. We're just doing physical. So weapon size equals base damage to endurance. So our weapon size is 6. So if we get a 14 or higher, which we will because of spending resources, that's our base damage. And you can see 30 endurance, is a little bit above average. Let's say 25 endurance is about average. So you might be thinking, well, that's not too bad. But you have load, which is how much junk you're carrying. So if your load, and I think this is fairly low, was 15, once your endurance is less than load, you become weary. And weary means that no longer you no longer recover stagger. So any stagger you take, you keep. And that just increases that ticking clock to your crit. To get rid of weary, you can spend movement points to drop a single piece of gear. And so you can take your helm off. Since helms are a decent amount of load, it reduces your armor, but if your choice is continue like not being able to recover from stagger, where you're going to be making armor checks versus potentially getting rid of stagger, reducing the chance you have to make them, I think that's generally going to be a wise choice. And then we talked about it briefly in the previous video about how you have to decide how your gear is packaged. Are you putting individual pieces like one load potions or one load alchemist fires? Are you putting that on your belt or your bandolier where it's secure, but it's not easy to drop that? Whereas if you put all your stuff into a backpack, it's one action, like your movement action, basically to drop the backpack. So you can dump a lot of load at once, but if you put things that you might actually want on your person in there, then you don't have access to them. So those are decisions players will have to make, and it's in there just because I enjoy that idea, because it also helps describe your character too. How you package your loot around yourself there's a mechanical reason to think about it, and that also reinforces the narrative. And that's one of the themes, I think, of this game, is trying to have narrative and mechanics reinforce each other continuously. All right, so on a regular success, 6 damage, so we'd have, 24 endurance left. But if we're attacking, say we're attacking a creature that is 30 endurance, and we start getting 6s, or we spend focus, or the allies spend gravitas to boost some of these dice to 6s. So even with this starting roll, we could potentially, let's see, potentially we could have 3 6s, and that will be, in this case, it is just 3 times 6. So, and actually, that's just from these, plus another 6. Well, I shouldn't put it that way. Plus base damage. So, potentially, if all 3 of these 6s were boosted to a 6 and or rolled 6, we could use all of them for power attacking, plus our base, and we could get up to 24 damage in a single hit. Now, this is definitely possible, especially towards the beginning of an adventure, where focus and gravitas in the party are plentiful. I think boosting 1 dice to a 6 is going to be pretty cheap, and most likely kind of a recommended thing to do, but this is honestly overkill. Doing this much endurance damage to a target at the cost of a bunch of focus and gravitas is almost like opting into a big spell attack that damages those resources. So you can do it, and it'll be cool when it happens. But I personally don't recommend burning this much, because you're not going to need to do 24 damage to a target to make the target weary. And you've already inflicted 1 stagger, so just keep hitting the target, spend resources modestly, and eventually you're going to get those crits as that stagger builds up. So, let's see here. Let's make this tiny now. We don't need this in the way. All right, and I guess one way to mitigate this, which I didn't put on here. No, I guess we'll include it in defense, because it is a defensive option. So when you take a hit, one thing you can do is give ground. Now, giving ground doesn't cost an action or a reaction or a movement or anything. So you always have it as an option. And what it does is it 1/2s the incoming endurance damage. But the target that's the attacker all right, this may a long sentence, but I feel like there's a purpose to it. All right, so give ground. You can 1/2 the incoming endurance damage, but the attacker gets to move you, or move the target who's opting into giving ground. You can move them a number of spaces in any direction. You cannot move them closer to yourself, but you can keep them at the same distance, or you can push them away. So, for example, this gets into reach. If you're, which I guess we'll cover before critical, if you have a one-handed melee weapon, reach equals 1. So if you just had a one-handed sword or an axe or a hammer or whatever. So that's one-handed. You could move them one space. So you could move them to the side. You could push them away one. It's up to you. And where you choose to move them, there could be reasons where you really want to give ground, but the enemy might be able to move you into something terrain wise that you may not want to be inside of. In the worst case scenario, that could be a cliff. They could push you into water. Who knows? The possibilities are endless, and using using sixes to push people around with hammers or just in general, because you can always push people. Hammers can just push people farther. If you don't have a hammer, you can always push people on a six, but it's always just one space. With a hammer, you can push people more than one space. I think a one-handed hammer can push people two, and a two-handed hammer can push people three. So you can really get to knocking people around with hammers, which could be, depending on your terrain, at least on a grid map, that could be pretty hazardous. And I think you could include hazards in zones too. It'd just be assumed, like you'd have to call out that there are locations inside of a particular zone that are hazardous, and it is assumed that characters are not in those. But then when you get to pushing, that could be interesting. And that's probably just going to vary based on GM personally, how much pushing is needed to get something into a hazardous sub area in a zone. And it's possible that they don't even worry about distance, and it's just if you get a six and you want to push somebody into a hazard, you can. Or you could say you have to push somebody twice to get them into a hazard, otherwise that could make hazards potentially more dangerous than they would be if you're playing on a grid. But anyways, we'll get to zone base combat for ideas. So that's giving ground. So even with this 24 damage attack, you could still give ground and half this to 12. So there's another reason why it's not necessarily the best idea to burn tons and tons and tons of resources on every attack to do maximum damage. Because ultimately you're just hitting one thing. Now, if it's a final fight, a boss fight, then sure, you should burn resources, but I would hope that the ordeal you went through to get to that boss fight isn't leaving, like, you shouldn't have full resources when you're in those situations, precisely to kind of avoid a situation where the players just alpha strike something. And occasionally that might happen, and I think the players should get, if the players work hard in another way to make things easier for themselves, so they have more resources through clever tactics and whatever, clever ideas, then of course they deserve the win. But in general, there should be enough obstacles to try to drain their pool so that doing something like this is a lot harder. Anyways, so there's give ground as a thing that anyone can do when you're hit with a melee weapon. Giving ground is not an option when you're hit with a spell or you're hit with something that isn't a weapon. If you're hit with a spell that's imitating a weapon, then I would say that give ground would be. So basically, if it hits armor, or if it targets the armor defense, then give ground should be an option. If it doesn't target the armor defense, then give ground doesn't make sense, because if you get hit with fire or freezing cold, you can't give ground to get away from that necessarily. So I don't know, we'll see. Maybe I'll change my mind on this in playtesting. So defense, we already kind of covered that you can make, there's no set defense check. You have to describe how you're defending yourself, and in most cases that's going to revolve around you using a weapon to try to parry an incoming attack, knock it out of the way. Things get interesting with ranged weapons. So Ranged weapons work a little bit differently. And I guess we'll cover that in reach and range. Well, so I guess I'll finish up one-handed. I'll finish up the melee weapons with reach and range, and then I'll get into ranged weapons. So this is just a baseline. All one-handed melee weapons have a reach of 1. Two-handed weapons have a reach of 2. And then the fun part is pole arms have +1 reach. So if you're wielding a one-handed spear, since that is a pole arm, it has 2 reach. And that's kind of the big claim to fame for pole arms, is they give you a bonus to defense when someone is at the maximum reach, and they just have more reach in general. So a two-handed pole arm has 3 reach. And I just like the idea of all, like, two-handed weapons are bigger than one. And sure, they're not gigantic, but I feel like in a grid-based game, if you're playing in a grid-based game, a little bit of suspension of disbelief at how much range these weapons can actually reach when you're in a world with magic and, you know, burning people alive. Giving melee something tactical to kind of chew on and deciding what weapon they want to use, I think is worth it for a little bit of unrealisticness in terms of how much reach these weapons have. So two-handed melee, if it's not a polearm, they work just fine when people are close to you. Polearms tend to, actually, I take that back. There is one caveat about reach. You do suffer disadvantage with when you're using a weapon that has reach, the closer people are to you, because you can't use it, you can't get the maximum swing that you would. And this is for attacks only. So you can still defend with a weapon just fine. But attacking somebody when they're close to you, so if you have a reach 2 weapon and someone's up right next to you with a reach 1, the reach 1 will be able to attack you and they won't have any problem. The reach 2 weapon, if you try to attack this person, you're going to have a disadvantage on it. And that's just the trade-off that I think needs to be made for the incentive for using reach 1 weapons is getting close to people with longer reach weapons is going to be a bit of an ordeal. I guess we'll go to closing the distance before critical. But once you're there, inside their reach, they have a choice to make. And I think this is also kind of reinforced from historical medieval combat, where soldiers would use pikes and polearms. But then when the enemy kind of pushed past those weapons, everyone would switch to short range weapons because it was just impossible to use the polearm at that point. And this kind of factors back into the load question. You may want to, like, if you want to use a spear, you're probably also going to want to have a one-handed melee weapon, probably a sword. And then you're replicating a Roman soldier. So once someone closes the distance and your spear has a penalty to it, drop your spear, reduces your load, and you keep going. And I don't know. I think it's cool. And it gives people a reason to care about different weapon proficiencies, or at least consider the advantage to having multiple weapon skills with proficiency ratings, because different weapons have different trigger rules and are going to be useful for you in different situations. So it's probably a good idea that the characters are really speccing into physique and weapons, have at least two good weapon proficiencies rated out to handle like a wide range of situations. So let's get to closing the distance. So when you move, when you're moving, and you get next to a target that has more reach than you must make an attack against them to close the distance to continue moving. And this is assuming you have movement points left over. If you use all of your movement and you just get to the edge of their reach, then you're going to have to do this next turn. But when you have excess movement, say they're 4 spaces away and they have a reach 2 weapon. So you can move 2, now you're 2 spaces away from them. You must attack them with your shorter weapon to kind of parry their weapon out of the way. That's what this check is representing. If you are successful in this, you deal no damage to the target, but you can continue moving, and that's the end of that turn. You've now closed it, and you don't get to attack again, but your opponent now has a chance to react to you being next to them. And here's the choice. If you fail, the check, which again you shouldn't fail unless it's going to cost a decent amount of resources and you don't think it's worth it. On a failure, you don't take any damage either, but you have a choice to make. You can either take the hit and move as you would have, or you can decide, okay, I wasn't successful at parrying their weapon and I'm just going to stay at whatever their reach was. So in this case, you just stay at 2. You tried to parry, they countered it, and now you're at a standoff. If you take the hit, if you rolled a failure, but it was not a critical hit, so if you didn't get a 1, basically, you basically turn that active roll and you read it as if it was a reaction roll. So if there was a 1, or if you'd been staggered and it would have crit you, then if you choose to take the hit, you could end up making an armor check. So because you can see it, you can decide if it's worth treating it as a reaction roll or just leaving it. And if it's not a crit, you just take the hit and you just lose some endurance. So it's not that bad to just lose a little bit of endurance. But you got to be careful of these other ones. If you're treating it as a reaction roll, then the GM can trigger 1s as if they were 6s on a player made roll. And this is done just to condense rolls. I don't want to have the person move, make 1 check, fail, and then make a separate reaction roll. I don't think that's necessary. I think you can just use the existing roll as a reaction roll just to keep things moving. And that way the player already can look at it and they can make the decision once they're used to the system pretty quick if they want to tank the hit or leave it. All right. So then if you are the character who has just had the distance closed to them, you now have a choice to make. You can either try to attack the person with the disadvantage on your weapon, or you can attempt to do the same thing in reverse. You attack them to parry their weapon. It does not do damage to them. It just allows you to move away. So it's just exactly the same thing in reverse. And then the failure is the same in reverse. You can, if you fail, you can choose to take the hit as if your attack was a reaction, or instead of keeping it reach, you just don't move. So you try to distract them to disengage and move so you're back at reach again. And in this case, I mean, this still applies. your weapon is not at its optimal distance, so you're still going to suffer disadvantage. This kind of comes back to that choice of, is it worth trying to disengage? Maybe. I mean, you have advantage pool dice. It might be worth it to burn some resources to, fall back a little bit and force them to do this whole closing the distance thing again. But eventually, this dance is going to end. And you're not going to want to keep spending resources to playing this close the distance, disengage, close the distance, disengage thing. And moving away, this is the same spiel you have to go through. This is basically how attack of opportunity works. If you want to move, you have to make the attack check to parry them, and then if you fail, you can choose to just take the hit as if it was a reactive strike or attack of opportunity, or you can choose to just stay where you're at and not take any damage. And then critical. So player facing, you want 12 or lower based on your target stagger and threat. So your weapon might have threat on it or be able to get threat from sixes to give your dice, pushing your roll closer towards a crit, and then stagger is the enemy's facing value, pushing them closer to a crit. And then when you're doing a reactive check, then it's 1 or higher, and then based on your stagger and the enemy's threat against you, just as you on some weapons you can use sixes to increase your threat range, the GM can use ones against you to increase their opponent's threat range. And you might be wondering if the enemies can spend focus and gravitas to lower dice to be a 1, and they can. Enemies, I don't want this to turn into a bidding war, so it does not, in this case, it doesn't change your roll, because that will turn the game into a bit of a bidding war between the GM and the players, and I don't want to create that type of tension. So in the case where the GM wants to get ones and they spend focus or gravitas from NPCs, they can reduce dice to ones, but it doesn't change whatever you actually roll. So that's just so the GM can get trigger rolls. And I have thought about the GM just using threat to power up enemies. So I guess I'm a little undecided on that, but right now I think enemies are just going to have focus and gravitas, or they'll be in a horde in a group, and they'll share the pool and they can spend it. I think for now that's how it's going to work, but we'll see. Maybe people will find it simpler if it's just a natural 1, or if the GM has to spend meta currency to achieve it instead of spending resources from the actual enemy's NPC character sheet. All right. So everything we've been talking about has been grid-based. Right now, movement is kind of your standard 6-space movement deal. And that everything I've talked about so far has kind of been within the context or the assumption that you're playing in a grid-based game. Spellcasting, when I talked about spellcasting before, your base spellcasting range is 3 spaces. However, gear like wands, staffs, magic rings, whatever, increase your range of how far you can cast spells drastically. And then bows and crossbows have different ranges. But for the most part, they're going to be able to reach everybody in most combats. But then again, that is why if you're using grid, that's why you're using it for that fidelity. And then for zone based, that's where things get a little interesting because with zones, the way I the way I would do it is I would assume that if so spellcasting range, anyone in the same zone would be within range 3. And then for a wand, which is the next one up, wand would be able to cast to adjacent zones, and then staffs would be able to cast to 2 zones away. And for zone-based combat, I think the best way to do it is to just have backline, backline, frontline, backline. If other people have other ways they want to do zones, that's kind of up to you. I honestly think zones is it's kind of weird. I think the game works great in grid and great in theater of the mind, but zones, it's really going to be up to the GM how much detail you want to go into, and if you care about reach. I still think you should care about reach, so you don't play in a grid, but you do care about how far away different characters are from each other, because that does people do make decisions on their weapons based on how far they can reach with them. And then for theater of the mind, you can do something really interesting. So actually, I'm not even going to put notes down for theater of the mind. I'll just explain a scenario that I thought of and how this system can work really well for it. And this is kind of a totally different way of how I would run a grid-based game. So in theater of the mind, imagine you've been tasked with going into a goblin lair and slaying a goblin general deep inside. And so as the players descend into the dark entrance, they hear the skittering in the distance and little flickers on the walls as their torches illuminate tunnels that haven't seen light in years. And as they progress, they eventually hear a goblin war cry as the goblin horde pours out from all different directions and tiny holes in the wall and through the main entrances that they've been using. You can now treat the entire goblin horde as a single large entity, and you don't have to worry about where the horde is positionally. It doesn't matter. The horde is everywhere. It's all around the players. So in this situation, you can let other players protect other players if you want, and that's already a base rule that maybe I'll cover in another video. Or you can just, you can say the whole party is basically shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by the horde, and if a player is playing more of a defensive character and they have a shield and they want to, and you attack, say, someone who's more of a caster, has low armor, and the shield person wants to intercept that and take the hit, I would let them do that. I wouldn't really fuss about it in the situation, because the point of the goblin horde isn't to kill the party. It's to drain their resources, and it's to kind of showcase how you can use a single character entity with this system, and I think it works pretty cool. So you can treat the goblins, use the even odd turn order from the previous video. And whenever the goblin horde goes, have it attack one of the characters, let somebody defend, resolve that. As the players fight back against the horde, it loses endurance, just like a regular single character would in a grid-based game. And you can keep it, honestly, you don't even need to have it be more endurance than a single character or a single goblin. Because the point of the horde is that you can't eradicate it completely. All you can do is scare it off. And so as you stagger the horde and you lower its endurance, and then the horde becomes weary, and eventually you crit it and you get through the armor and you wound it. Once you wound the horde, then the horde retreats. And you can roll a die if you want, maybe a d6, to determine how many more exploration turns the players have before the horde returns and hounds them once more. And so they always have this clock in the back of their mind as the horde's always there. They know they can make the horde retreat, but they can't kill all of them. There's too many goblins. And besides, their goal isn't necessarily to eliminate the horde, it's to kill the goblin general, because once he's dead, the horde will scatter anyways and won't be much of a threat to the local people. So then once they make their way through, and maybe the horde comes back 2 or 3 times throughout this, they explore different rooms, they get some items, some treasure, their resources are dwindling through environmental issues inside the caves. Maybe they have to descend through a long shaft, and that takes them up, that extracts some general resources like rope and grappling hooks. Then they finally get to the boss lair, and they find the goblin general waiting for them. The goblin horde would instantly return, regardless of what the clock for their return said, and they would now have 2 characters to fight against. One is the horde, and one is the general. And this is now the GM can finally make use of gravitas, and this is why I'm in favor of just using gravitas and focus for NPCs. So the horde could use focus before on itself, but the horde could not use gravitas because the horde itself can't inspire itself or coordinate with itself. But the goblin general can use his gravitas to now boost the goblin horde. So if you've been burning focus to get 6s to kind of really beat up the PCs, now you have a whole nother fresh supply of resources you can spend on the horde from the goblin general, and the goblin general will have all of his focus, and now he'll be fresh. Now the players have 2 things to worry about. And what you can do is you can make it so that anytime characters land a crit on the goblin general, you can transfer that crit over to the goblin horde, and then they scatter. And you can make them scatter for, I would say, either the GM has to spend threat to bring the goblin horde back immediately, or the next time an odd is rolled, the GM does not gain threat, and it's sort of like a way of skipping the GM's turn, you know. Or I guess another way to do it is you could say that the goblin general has to take 2 turns. That's probably a better way to do it, honestly. So you make an enemy clock for the goblin general after he's gone twice, however long that takes. So if the players have a really good streak of rolling evens, they might end this pretty quick. But you know what? Because that's random and they don't know what the dice are going to roll until it lands, it's going to feel pretty cool if they get, 3 evens in a row and they're able to just kind of dogpile on the goblin general and wipe him out. So yeah, I think that kind of concludes the example. The horde can never be truly defeated. It can only be scared off for probably 1 to 2 enemy turns of the general as he's alone. And then the horde comes back, and then they can once again sort of sacrifice themselves to take the wound for the general. And there you go. And that way, you can keep the general with just 1 wound. He doesn't need 2 wounds. He can just have 1, because he basically has a semi-infinite reoccurring supply of wounds in the form of the horde to take the hits for him. And that's why I think the system works really cool for Theater of the Mind and kind of quick and dirty or short campaigns, short one-shots. You could just run Theater of the Mind and use that style for the way that these characters are constructed, because I'm sure some people might be thinking that this is a lot to keep track of, and it would be if you're keeping track of this for a lot of different units. But because you can condense, you can make hordes out of these pretty easily and just turn it into, once they're wounded, they scatter. Or if you want kind of a more condensed horde in kind of a more traditional Pathfinder 2 sense, where it counts as like a large creature, you could just give it multiple wounds but then put in a caveat where if you have a way to do an area of effect attack, you can basically wipe out the horde with a single wound in that case. Because if you think about it, if you're doing a grid thing where you have a 4x4 large creature, and you do an AoE attack and you do one wound to each section, then that would do 4 wounds to the whole horde and wipe it out. So that's kind of how I would do if you're doing a grid based thing and you have like a horde of rats as a 4x4, or even a horde of goblins, a little like a small horde, not the ever present like tidal wave horde that I was referring to in the Theater of the Mind example. So I hope that was interesting and shed some insight into kind of the core melee combat engine here and how it differs from the base One Ring, if you're familiar with that. If you're not familiar with that, I'm not going to recap that game because this system has sort of evolved into its own thing. In the pursuit of adding magic, a lot of other things change to keep things consistent. All right, that will be it for now.